Hello everyone and welcome to our public lecture. I'm Professor Claire Johnson and I'm the Director of Australian Catholic University's Centre for Liturgy. On behalf of ACU and the Centre's team, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. As we gather, we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's spiritual and cultural connection to country and pay respects to Australia's First Peoples, the custodians of the land from which we join this gathering across Australia. We thank them for their continued custodianship. We respectfully acknowledge elders past, present and emerging and thank them for their wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps. With us today, we have attendees from right across Australia, as well as the United States and New Zealand. You're all most welcome. Our topic for this public lecture is one that is both very much of our time and one that reaches back into the earliest centuries of the Church's tradition. Shortly after the conclusion of Vatican II, segments of the Catholic Church began to reconsider the pre-Vatican II restrictions on women's participation in liturgical ministries. In the almost 60 years since the promulgation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, a growing acceptance of women taking more public roles in liturgical celebrations can be discerned within official post-conciliar church teaching. Slow, incremental advances have seen women being permitted to enter the sanctuaries of churches where previously they were forbidden entry and approach the altar, proclaim the readings in the liturgy, distribute Holy Communion as extraordinary ministers, serve at the altar, and be legitimately included among those who have their feet washed in the mandatum ceremony held during the Holy Thursday Mass of the Lord's Supper. In January 2021, Pope Francis ordered a change to the Code of Canon Law so that women may be formally instituted as lectors and acolytes. In Australia, women constitute the majority of attendees at liturgy and a large proportion, if not a majority, of those serving in liturgical ministries carried out by lay people. But can they do more? To guide us in considering the topic of women deacons, I'm very honoured to introduce our special guest speaker. Dr Phyllis Zagano is an internationally acclaimed Catholic scholar and lecturer on contemporary spirituality and women's issues in the Church. She has taught at Fordham and Boston universities and presently holds a research appointment at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. Dr. Zagano has won 2 Fulbright Awards and has held numerous visiting fellowships and professorships, including at Waterford Institute of Technology, Ireland, St. Leo University, Tampa, Florida, Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, Ireland, Yale Divinity School, and St. Thomas Aquinas College in Sparkill, New York. Her biographical listings include Marquise Who's Who, and her professional papers are held by the Women in Leadership Archives at Loyola University in Chicago. Dr. Zagano is the author or editor of 25 books, including in religious studies, including Holy Saturday, an argument for the restoration of the female diaconate in the Catholic Church, Women and Catholicism, Gender, Communion and Authority, Women Deacons, Essays with Answers, Women, Icons of Christ, Women Religious, Women Deacons, Questions and Answers, and Just Church, published by Garrett Publishing in 2021 in Australia, which reviews Catholic social teaching and modern synods in relation to current and prospective ministry by women. Dr. Zagano's research has been translated into numerous foreign languages, and she publishes regularly in popular and refereed journals and media outlets, including the National Catholic Reporter. In 2012, she received the Catherine of Siena Distinguished Layperson Award from Voice of the Faithful, and in 2014, she received the Isaac Hecker Award for Social Justice from the Paulist Centre in Boston. Pope Francis appointed her in 2016 to the Papal Commission for the Study of Women in the Diaconate, to which she belonged from 2016 to 2018. It is a great pleasure to warmly welcome Dr. Phyllis Zagano. Over to you, Phyllis.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claire. I am really honored to be with you all. I'm sorry I'm not there in Australia with you, but I think with Zoom we are able to reach a little bit farther. So I appreciate the opportunity to think about and with you and talk about women deacons and the Synod. And the question, of course, I think on everybody's mind is what happens now. So, in my mind, at least from my vantage point, Australia and New Zealand appear to have made their synodal wishes known. The church can, and I think in fact should, restore women to the ordained diaconate. And the historical facts about women are well known, and women deacons are well known. Women deacons ministered in different ways in different places during different eras. 2016, the International Union of Superiors General asked Pope Francis why, given that so many women were already performing diaconal ministry, women could not be ordained as deacons today. Since then, 2 commissions presented private reports to the Pope. The Instrumentum Laboris on the Synod on Synodality reports, and I quote, most of the continental assemblies and the synthesis of several episcopal conferences call for the question of women's inclusion in the diaconate to be considered, and asks, is it possible to envisage this and in what way? So that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about. I have 3 points for our discussion today. Where have we been? Where are we now? And where will we go next? There was much discussion about restoring women to the ordained diaconate well before the International Union of Superiors General, the membership organization of some 1,903 Superiors General of Apostolic Institutes of Women's Religious Life, asked Pope Francis for a study on the question. As early as the 17th century, Oratorian priest Jean Morin produced an extensive study of the liturgical rituals used by bishops to ordain women as deacons. Reviewing manuscripts in Greek, Latin, and Syriac, Morin concluded that these met the criteria for true ordinations as set down by the Council of Trent. The 3 oldest of these in Greek were nearly identical for male and female deacons. The ordinations were celebrated within the sanctuary, at the altar, by the bishop, who laid hands on the man or woman to be ordained while invoking the Holy Spirit. The bishop placed a stole around the neck of each, and each self-communicated from the chalice. Importantly, each person, male or female, was ordained, quote, to the diaconate. The ordination ritual for a woman deacons included the following prayer, and I'll read it to you. O eternal God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, creator of man and woman, who filled with the Spirit Miriam, Deborah, and Anna, and Huldah, who did not disdain that your only begotten Son should be born of a woman, who also in the tabernacle of testimony and in the temple appointed the guardians of the holy gates. Now also look upon your servant, who is to be appointed to the diaconate, and give to her the Holy Spirit, and cleanse her from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, so that she may worthily perform the work which is entrusted to your glory and the praise of your Christ, with whom glory and worship be to you and to the Holy Spirit forever. Amen. Several manuscripts vouch for the practice of ordaining women as deacons. The Vatican's Apostolic Library holds 3 from the East. I can give you the names: Barberini, 336, the Vatican Greek manuscript, 1872, and the Codex Syriacus Vaticanus, number 19, and 2 from the West. And they're also held in libraries outside of the Vatican, Italy, and in France, and in England, and in Germany. The 8th century ritual book of Egbert, Bishop of York, England, included one ceremony for the blessing of either a male or a female deacon with the prayer, give heed, Lord, to our prayers, and upon this your servant, send forth that spirit of your blessing in order that, enriched by heavenly gifts, he, and the manuscript says he or she, might be able to obtain grace through your majesty and by living well, offer an example to others. Now, we know that women continued to be ordained as deacons up to and possibly through the 12th century in the West, when the diaconate as a permanent and distinct order was subsumed to the priesthood through the cursus honorum. For the most part, the diaconate became primarily ceremonial, and diaconal ordination was merely a step or a stage before priesthood. By that time, the practice of ordaining women as deacons, already mostly hidden away in abbeys and monasteries, simply died out. One notable exception is Ottoni or Otto of Lucca in Italy, who is known to have ordained women as deacons, presumably for his diocese during the 12th century. Now, while the practice of ordaining women as deacons died out, the discussion did simmer and was picked up again in the 1970s. Second Vatican Council called for the reestablishment of the diaconate as a distinct permanent order. And Pope Paul VI asked about it. It is presumed, but not verified, that the paper prepared by liturgist Cipriano Vagagini is the response to a direct request of Pope Paul VI, either to the International Theological Commission or to Vagagini himself. In an article published in 1974, Vagagini writes that the women deacons of history were indeed ordained just as the male deacons were, and there is no reason not to return to the practice. Vagagini's voice was echoed by historian Roger Grison, now emeritus professor at Louvain in Belgium. A debate ensued between Grison, whose book on the subject appeared first in French in 1972 and later in English in 1976, and French liturgist Émile-Georges Marimort. Now, Marimort's book appeared both in French and English in 1982. Grison and Marimort use the same materials and interpret them differently. But even so, Marimort concludes that the facts of history are only partially useful because they are, in fact, only partial. Now, Vagagini repeated his positive opinion in 1987 to a synod on the laity, writing, and I quote, "I have been asked to express my opinion about the possibility that the Church, if it judges it appropriate, would be able to confer on women the sacrament of order in the diaconal grade. Before 231 bishops and 60 lay auditors," Vagagini concluded, and I quote, this is now 1987, "One senses the legitimacy and urgency for competent authorities to admit women to the sacrament of order of the diaconate and to grant them all the functions, even the liturgical functions, that in the present historic moment of the Church are considered necessary for the greater benefit of believers, not excluding, as I personally maintain, if it is judged pastorally appropriate, equally between the liturgical functions of men deacons and women deacons." Now, by 1992, the International Theological Commission, the ITC, formally picked up the question, concluding its study in 1997 with a report of some 17 pages. The report was printed, numbered, and voted upon by the whole ITC, but the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, refused to sign and promulgate it. Why? Simply, the ITC saw no problem with restoring the tradition of ordaining women as deacons. So from 1997 to 2002, a new ITC subcommittee considered a somewhat broader topic, eventually producing some 78 pages and concluding, first, the deaconesses mentioned in the tradition of the ancient church as evidenced by the right of institution and the functions they exercised were not purely and simply the equivalent of deacons. Two, the unity of the sacrament of holy orders in the clear distinction between the ministries of the bishop and priests on the one hand and the diaconal ministry on the other is strongly underlined by ecclesial tradition, especially in the teaching of the magisterium. And it concludes, in light of these elements, which have been set out in the present historico-theological research document, it pertains to the ministry of discernment which the Lord established in his church to pronounce authoritatively on this question. Now, the problems with this second ITC document are many, too many to detail here. Not only does it depend heavily on Marty Mort, some 18 sections or sentences paraphrased or taken in their entirety from a book by then Father Gerhard L. Müller, then a professor in Munich, are not cited. Moreover, the only holdover from the first subcommittee was Cardinal Ratzinger's former student, Portuguese professor Father Henrique de Noronha Galvão. In August 2002, shortly before the publication of the second ITC document on the diaconate, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF, issued a decree of excommunication against the 7 women ordained by schismatic Bishop Romulo Braschi in violation of Canon 1331 of the Code of Canon Law. A second decree on the attempted ordination of some Catholic women appeared in December 2002. So these 2 documents are appearing pretty much contemporaneously with them. Notably, the decrees speak only to priestly ordination and the breaking of the law. And it is known that these women were also ordained as deacons before they were ordained as priests. The second decree states that the prohibition of ordaining women as priests is, quote, a doctrine that the church has always taught and lived, and that, quote, the denial of this doctrine is rightly considered the denial of a truth that pertains to the Catholic faith. However, each expressly eliminates the question of women in the diaconate. So, discussions about Catholic women deacons and Catholic women priests continued to cross paths until the 2016 meeting of the International Union of Superiors General, UISG, separates them. What prevents the church from including women among permanent deacons, as was the case in the primitive church? The UISG asked. Now that question rocked the room and the media as well. One Rome-based US journalist had managed to slide into the closed UISG session with Pope Francis. He heard the question, and more importantly, he heard the answer. There would be a pontifical commission to study women deacons, and the premise for this establishment was the case in the primitive church. He broke the story, and by August 2nd, 2016, the commissioners were named. I think it's important to note that this story was broken, and because the story was broken, the entire transcript eventually had to be published. This commission is the first known pontifical commission with a membership that was 50% male and 50% female. And I was included as the only person to travel from the Western Hemisphere. And regrettably, there was no member from Oceania. The commissioners were asked not to speak about the commission work, and I was asked specifically and personally not to speak about the topic of my research, women deacons, lest it appear I was betraying that confidence. As far as I know, none of the commissioners spoke publicly before July 2018, and in January 2019, Belgian Jesuit Bernard Poitier, also a commissioner, and I spoke at Fordham University in New York. Then, at a May 2019 UISG meeting that I attended, Pope Francis gave the organization's president what he said was the little they had agreed upon, and said that if he were to decide, he needed more theological and historical foundation for it, while promising the work would continue. The original commissioners heard nothing. And in response to the request from the October 2019 Amazon Synod, Pope Francis said he would recall the commission, perhaps adding 1 or 2 members to it. In January 2020, the new UISG president told Global Sisters Report, an online journal, that Pope gave the history portion of the report to them. He had promised, quote, other papers from the commission if they asked. They did not ask, and as far as I know, have not asked. In February 2020, as the COVID pandemic loomed, I presented as part of a conference entitled Unlocking the Future, Women and the Diaconate, organized by the Faculty of Canon Law of the Catholic University of Leuven. During my days in Belgium, I sat for at least one media interview and was also videotaped for nearly 3 hours by a team led by professor and journalist Rick Torfs. I mention this for 2 reasons. First, I have no idea whatever became of that interview. And second, I have since been recorded twice, once by a French film crew and more recently by an American group. There is interest, and interest in more than media circles, as I will note later. In Belgium at that conference, my talk began by mentioning a footnote to a talk given by Pope Benedict XVI, in which he was commenting on the 2002 ITC document on the diaconate. Benedict said, extensive study concluded with the assertion that the purely historical perspective did not allow for any definitive certainty to be reached. In the final analysis, the question of women deacons had to be decided on the doctrinal level. The problem, of course, is that neither was the 2002 study, ITC study, extensive, nor did it specify how the decision would be made. The document said, quote, it pertains to the ministry of discernment, which the Lord established in his church to pronounce authoritatively on this question. The assumption was and is that the decision was up to the Pope, who could simply grant a derogation from Canon 1024, quote, a baptized male alone receives sacred ordination validly, or by a motu proprio, simply change the canon to read, a baptized male alone receives priestly or episcopal ordination validly. Such, in fact, was the determination by an ad hoc committee of the Canon Law Society of America in 1995. Excuse me. Anyway, Bernard Poitier was also on the program at Leuven in February of 2020. His French presentation, published by Leuven in English, told the story of our commission. These are the facts he presented. 1, we were to establish historically and theologically the facts about women deacons in the early church. 2, the Pope did not ask for theological reflection or pastoral recommendations. 3, our report was not intended to be published. Poitier continued, because the commission was entrusted to then Archbishop Louis Ladaria, the secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the operation was from the start under a certain amount of tension, and there was no deadline. I'll point out now that Gerhard Mueller at the time was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Poitier noted 3 obstacles in his talk. 1, what did the early church mean by ordination? 2, how could we not give in to anachronism when speaking of sacramental theology? 3, what does the unity of the sacrament of order signify in light of the 1976 and 1994 documents regarding women priests and Pope Benedict's 2009 modification of canon law with Omnium in Mentum? That canon specifically delineated the distinction that the priesthood, the diaconate is not the priesthood. As Poitier recounted, we met in CDF offices in Rome 4 times, November 2016 and March 2017 and September of 2017 and in June of 2018. Poitier also pointed out that during the 2-year span, 2 commissioners received the Ratzinger Prize, one during our first year, the other during our second year. Poitier noted in his talk that Pope Francis twice visited the commission. During our second meeting at CDF, the Pope emphasized the importance and value of women's perspectives. Following the third meeting, the Pope appeared at our midday meal at Casa Santa Marta. Poitier recounted that as secretary to the commission, at that meal, he told the Holy Father that the divergent views of the committee were difficult to harmonize. Pope Francis replied he wanted to know everything. As Poitier stated, the resulting report was quite minimal and entrusted to Cardinal Ladaria, who forwarded a response from the Pope dated July 2nd, 2018, to all of us. We were never given the report as presented to Pope Francis, nor did we receive copies of the other papers the Pope referred to. I can only assume that our report became the history portion and the rest of our work was otherwise accounted for. Poitier continued that there was, quote, too great a divergence of theological positions at the starting point, which Poitier believes shows the question had not yet to mature in the church. That was in February of 2020. While in response to the request of the Amazon Synod, Pope Francis said he would recall our commission and perhaps name 2 or 3 additional members, on April 8th, 2020, the Pope named an entirely new commission. This time, 5 men, 5 women. The new commission met for 1 week in September 2021 and for 1 week in June of 2022. Their report has not been republished, and it appears the members did not receive copies of it. One might assume the second commission report was transmitted by its secretary, CDF official, French Father Denis Dupont-Fauville, who happens to have been a doctoral student of Cardinal Ladaria at the Pontifical Gregorian University. So then on October 10th, 2021, Pope Francis solemnly opened the Worldwide Synod on Synodality, which admittedly got off to a bumpy start. Many individual bishops and others simply did not understand what was happening. The 16th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops was planned for October 2023, and yet it did not seem to be a Synod of Bishops only. A woman, Xavier's sister Natalie Beckhardt, was one of 2 Synod undersecretaries. The other is Augustinian Father Louis Marin de Saint Martin. Historically, undersecretaries had votes at the Synod. Soon, it became apparent that Sister Natalie would also have a vote. Commentators of every description questioned the inclusion of a woman with a vote. Even the very term Synod on Synodality was questioned. The first sentence of the preparatory document seems to have explained it all. The Church of God is convoked in Synod. The document continued. Pope Francis invites the entire church to reflect on a theme that is decisive for its life and mission. It is precisely this path of synodality which God expects of the church and of the 3rd millennium. This journey, which follows in the wake of the church's renewal proposed by the Second Vatican Council, is both a gift and a task. By journeying together and reflecting together on the journey that has been made, the church will be able to learn through her experience which processes can help her to live communion, to achieve participation, to open herself to mission. Our journeying together is, in fact, what most effectively enacts and manifests the nature of the church as the pilgrim and missionary people of God. The key words which have carried through the process were and are communion, participation, and mission. National Episcopal conferences were at first asked to convene synodal listening sessions via their dioceses to accommodate the results of other groups' meetings and to present reports to the Synod office by April 2022. That deadline, however, was extended to August 15th, 2022, by which time 112 of 114 national Episcopal conferences submitted reports. As the National Episcopal Conference reports are being collected from July 3rd to the 9th of 2022, the Second General Assembly of the Fifth Plenary Council of Australia met in Sydney. Some 35 motions were put to both consultative and deliberative votes, each requiring a 2/3 majority approval. As finally approved, Decree 4, Article 4 of Witnessing to the Equal Dignity of Women and Men reads that should the universal law of the Church be modified to authorize the diaconate for women, the Plenary Council recommends that the Australian bishops examine how best to implement it in the context of the Church in Australia. The Eastern Catholic Churches in Australia will interpret the decrees of the Fifth Plenary Council of Australia in accordance with the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches and the traditions of each church sui juris. In accordance with Canon 446 of the Code of Canon Law, this decree is not to be promulgated until it has been reviewed by the Apostolic See. It will be promulgated in Australian Catholic Record and the website of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference in accordance with the usual practice. The decrees will oblige 6 months after promulgation. Now, the vote on the original wording, as you know, caused consternation in the council hall. After the bishops' vote turned down its approval, the members, including 2 bishops, refused to take their seats. In retrospect, and given the history of women deacons and the trajectory of the discussion, it may not have been the place of what was essentially a local synod to say that women could be sacramentally ordained, only to say that it would accommodate any new law that may come from Rome. As you know, in November of 2022, the bishops of Australia approved the final decrees and submitted them to Rome for final approval. As for the Synod on Synodality, between September 21 and October 2nd, 2022, the National Episcopal Conference reports were synthesized by a 26-person writing team, which met at Frascati, Italy. In addition to 112 National Episcopal Conference reports, there were reports from 17 dicasteries of the Roman Curia, a report of what has come to be called the Digital Synod of some 100,000 participants, a synthesis from the superiors of religious orders around the world, and a report from 150 lay associations. Anecdotally, at least, while these other reports were available to the writers at Frascati, the various language groups concentrated on the national reports. And the Frascati meeting produced the working document for the continental stage, entitled Enlarge the Space of Your Tent, which was published in October of 2022. Continental assemblies met between January and March 2023. Each of these, North America for the US and Canada, which met by Zoom only, Latin America and the Caribbean, which included Mexico, which met in 4 regional meetings, Oceania, meeting in Fiji, Europe, which met in Prague, Asia, Africa and Madagascar, and the Middle East, which met in Beirut. Each produced a response, and all the responses were completed and published during the spring of 2023. The report of the Oceania Synod Continental Assembly synthesized reports from the National Episcopal Conferences of Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, and Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, the Episcopal Conferences, and from the Eastern Catholic Churches in Oceania. These were synthesized during in-person meetings in Suva, Fiji, between February 5 and 9, 2023. And this meeting included participation by Cardinal Michael Czerny, the prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, Perth Archbishop Timothy Costello, and Sister Natalie Beckhart. The Oceania Task Force Chair was Professor Susan Pascoe, President of the Australian Council for International Development, And the coordinating writer for the document was the Reverend Dr. Orman Rush of Australian Catholic University. All have been named as members of the October Synod meeting in Rome. Now, the report of the Fiji meeting seems to minimize calls for greater recognition and participation by women in the church. Routinely writing, some argued for one submission, but one group, and specified that while there was consensus on the need for an enhanced role for women in the church, the issue of women's ordination was only explicitly raised in one submission, so that, quote, acting on the inequalities of women called for equal, just, and full participation of women in church governance, mission, and ministry, and, quote, recognizing their admissibility to any role, such as deacon, priest, or representative on decision-making councils. This came from the Australia votes. The New Zealand submission noted that there was no request for the consideration of ordination of women as priests, although one group asked for their ordination as deacons. Now, further on, the report affirmed the view, quote, a minority concern was expressed that women were still barred from the permanent diaconate and ordained ministry. That report was approved by the new Executive Council of the Federation of Catholic Bishops' Conferences of Oceania and submitted by its president, Broken Bay Bishop Anthony Randazzo. The work of this and the 6 other continental assemblies was synthesized to produce the Instrumentum Laboris, which was published in June of 2023. This time, the writing team was somewhat smaller, and the document it produced is quite unusual. Rather than a set of prescriptions or answers to the commentary already made worldwide, the 4-part Instrumentum Laboris presents a way of proceeding and then presents sets of questions for each of the main themes of the Synod: communion, mission, and participation. I'd ask you to note that the order has changed from the original communion, participation, and mission to communion, mission, and participation, and for an interesting reason. The task is to understand what it means to be in communion, to understand the church's mission, and then to investigate how the people of God can and should participate. Recall that with its decree Ad Gentes on the missionary activity of the church, the Second Vatican Council spoke of the church as communion in mission, and in fact called all Christians to participate. The specific call today would be to participate in the tasks understood as evangelization and pastoral care, as noted by the Canon Law Society of America regarding the inclusion of women in the ordained diaconate in 1995. The question before us, wherever we are, is the same question some 450 persons, 364 voting members, will consider at round tables in the Paul VI Audience Hall between October 4th and 29th of this year. In addition to Pope Francis, among voters and non-voters alike, there will be some 273 bishops, 67 priests, 37 non-ordained men and women religious, 70 other laymen and women, and 1 deacon, Belgian deacon Gert de Kluber. The language of the Instrumentum Laboris regarding women deacons is interesting. While the document for the continental stage asks about a female diaconate, the Instrumentum Laboris seems to clarify the question, noting, quote, most of the continental assemblies and the syntheses of several episcopal conferences call for the question of women's inclusion in the diaconate to be considered. It asks immediately, is it possible to envisage this, and in what way? Of course, it is possible that the Instrumentum Laboris is also ambiguous, but apparently less so. Inclusion in the diaconate means inclusion in the diaconate. an order to which one is sacramentally ordained. Where will we, the Church, go from here? The synodal discussions so far and those that will continue in the future are not about doctrine. Communion is communion, and we agree to be one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Mission is mission, and the mission of the Church is to spread the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Participation is where the problem arises, at least where women are concerned. Who is called to do what? We do not need to clericalize the laity, as one argument against restoring women to the diaconate goes. If the Church needs deacons, then women can be included. Too many people argue that women cannot be ordained, that women cannot image Christ. That naive physicalism has taken hold in too many quarters of the Church. If I do not see Christ in you, no matter whether you are male or female, I do not see Christ at all. My hope is that where a bishop has determined he needs deacons and therefore women deacons, the Church will be enriched by their ordained ministry. Many lay women, and remember, all women, religious or not, are lay women, already perform diaconal service for the Church. Married women, single women, consecrated religious all serve the word, the liturgy, and charity. Women preach and teach. Women are acolytes and lectors. Women work in, even manage, social service agencies of every description. The great educational endeavors of women religious, the extraordinary hospitals and nursing homes they have established and run are joined by orphanages, food banks, soup kitchens, and similar organizations self-funded to care for children and feed the poor. What if all of these, or at least some of these, included women ordained as deacons among their workers and their leaders? Would you not prefer to hear the woman deacon who performed diaconal ministry speak about today's epistle and gospel? Recall, things were the same in the ancient world. As the book of Numbers recounted today, people were hungry. Moses heard, quote, family after family crying at the entrance of their tents. Matthew's gospel tells of Jesus feeding the multitude. The Church needs deacons today, as in every single day in history. The Second Vatican Council restored the diaconate as a permanent vocation, and it is time for the Church to recognize its needs, reclaim the past, and recognize the possibilities of the future. I thank you for listening. I think I have the opportunity to answer questions.
Certainly do, Phyllis. Thank you so very much. That was a very engaging and informative and detailed lecture. Thank you very much for the amount of detail you gave us. It's important to know those dates and events that you've recounted. We have the pleasure now of introducing a special guest respondent who will offer some thoughts on what Phyllis has presented, as well as some views of her own, before we take questions from other members of our gathering today. Sister Elizabeth Young, RSM, joins us from the far west of New South Wales. Sister Elizabeth was professed as a Sister of Mercy in 2010 and instituted to the Ministry of Catechist in 2023. She serves as Parish Life Coordinator in the Diocese of Wilcannia-Forbes, which, for those who don't know, is a rural diocese that covers an area about the size of the United Kingdom. Sister Elizabeth writes a blog on Australian diaconal ministry called Liturgy on the Margins. Sister Elizabeth, I invite you to unmute your microphone and share your response with us.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you very much, Phyllis. Really appreciated your talk today. I learn something new every time I hear you, and something else is picked up. It's a privilege to also share this webinar with you again, and I'm very grateful for the personal interest and pastoral support that you have given to myself and to our group, the Australian Catholics Exploring the Diaconate. This has been a lifetime of passion and work for you, and we all benefit from the well-researched and clear articulation of the subject of women in the permanent diaconate, past and we hope future. It is because of your tireless efforts that so many are learning about our history as a church and about the wide variety of ministerial solutions to ministerial needs and vocational callings beyond our common baptismal dignity. And it leads us to reflect on where the Spirit is calling in our church today in order to respond to, as you said, the need for feeding the multitude, the many needs for liturgical and sacramental ministry, evangelization, and that visible link between diaconal service and the liturgy. In a world where there is still so much inequality, violence, and discrimination, we could really do with the symbolic demonstration that woman and man, we are all one in Christ Jesus. Phyllis, you have done the tedious groundwork of investigation into the forms of ordination and ministry that existed for women in the past and the ongoing developments in theological understanding, magisterial discernment, and the sensus fidei. Our church has a rich history and tradition to draw on and build on. It's not static. This academic background is so important for any discussion about women and the permanent diaconate, from our day-to-day interactions with others to the important synodal process in Rome. Alongside this, people and groups such as ours are wanting to highlight and to celebrate the diaconal ministries that are already being performed by men and women that are under various role titles, who have been educated, formed, authorised and missioned by their local bishops or authorities to be the official church presence on the margins of society, to perform baptisms, funerals, Sunday liturgies, including preaching, to provide religious leadership in dioceses, parishes or chaplaincies, and in many ways to image Christ the servant. As you mentioned, this is where the question arose at the UISG meeting in 2016, from lived reality. And that is a space from which to proceed. How can we better, as a church, be church together? As the plenary council asked, and I think it's a relevant question still, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia and in the world at this time? Although in looking back at the plenary council, it may not have been the local church's place to pronounce that women could be sacramentally ordained, it was an understandable answer to that question. Considering women for the permanent diaconate is a clear response to the very major call in the plenary council processes for raising the ministry of women. However, the openness to the diaconate for women is just a small piece of that puzzle, one which is very conservative and applicable to a specific calling for some people. But it would be a terribly significant, symbolic and prophetic step, worthy of the successes of St. Phoebe. It would also, I hope, be a great positive enhancement for the current male permanent diaconate, our potential colleagues, completing the order's restoration since Vatican II. The current Synod on Synodality asks the big question: how does our participation enhance our communion and mission? We eagerly wait to see where the Spirit will lead. And as a final reference here in Australia to the Voice referendum happening later this year, institutional recognition and sitting at the table on matters that matter to us matters enormously. And it's because of you, Phyllis, that we know better who we are as a church, following Jesus' vision of the reign of God, so that we can better become all that we are meant to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Elizabeth. You have a very valuable perspective, and I'm so pleased that you've shared it with us today. Could I ask you just to say a little bit about your pastoral work so that people have a little bit more of an understanding of what exactly you are doing out in Wilcannia Forbes?
Thank you, Claire. So I've been sent here by our bishop and by our leader of the Sisters of Mercy to be a parish life coordinator here in Wilcannia. It's a small town of around 700. There has been no official church leader here for about 12 years before I came. So it was re-establishing a whole set of things around the parish, regular liturgies, visitation, funerals, baptisms, all of those things being able to be performed here, rather than provide the service from someone from 200 or 250 kilometres away, which was very costly for the community, particularly for funerals, which unfortunately can be fairly frequent here. So it's a real privilege to be in this position, and the bishop wanted to institute me as a catechist at the start of this year in order to provide this ministry on a more a footing that's recognised in ways particularly around the sacramental ministry. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm sure that we have a range of different questions that people would like to address, both in terms of what Phyllis has offered and also Sister Elizabeth's response there. So I'd like to open the floor to some questions. We don't have a huge number in the chat, but please feel free to pop your questions into the chat and we'll deal with them as they come. Also, if you would like to ask a question vocally, if you could raise your virtual hand, we will get to you as we can. So Charles Rue has put a question in the chat here, Phyllis. He has written, historical perspective is an important basic question, thank you. But what of contemporary needs? One, for women doing ministry to be officially recognised by ordination, and two, for female believers to be ministered to by their peers. Could you offer a little comment on that, Phyllis, please?
Well, I agree, and I often say history alone is not dispositive, because you know, the question is, were women in history ordained, blessed, were they called deacons or deaconesses? And I say yes. Because all of these things are possible and probable. It's important to note that women were sacramentally ordained in the past, even though a very few minority of scholars will argue against it. I was asked to provide the liturgical history, and it is there. And the manuscripts are there, and I have seen them, and liturgical scholars far better than I have reviewed them in their original languages, and conclude, just as Jean Morin did, just as Roger Grison did, and many others, that there was sacramental, these were sacramental ordinations insofar as the men were ordained, so were the women, I guess is the point. And that is the flaw in the 2002 International Theological Commission document, which says that the manner of institution is different. Well, of course it's different, because different pronouns are used. And in some, the Holy Spirit is invoked for the woman and as the type of the woman, and the Jesus is invoked as the type of the man. Saint Phoebe is invoked for the women. Saint Stephen is invoked for the man. But as I mentioned with Egbert, Bishop of York, the liturgy simply says, if you're ordaining a man, use these pronouns, and if you're ordaining a woman, use the others. I think the question of need really is what should drive the ordination of anyone to any ministry in our church. And I think that if we recognize that there is significant need for diaconal ministry around the world, certainly in rural areas such as Sister Elizabeth ministers in, the need is quite obvious. In other areas, it's simply not. But I think that the need speaks for itself, and the need specifically of women to be ministering to other women is known. Anecdotally, for example, most annulments are sought by women, but the change in canon law done by Pope Francis so that an annulment can be adjudicated by a single judge eliminates all women, because a single judge in any canonical trial must be a cleric, and so no woman can really judge the case. And while some women do intake and will write things up, in a small diocese, in a poor diocese, you can't afford to have a whole bunch of canon lawyers. So the need is obviated there. I think that women preaching, such as I said, women canon lawyers, and the simple ministry by women to women, that is something the Holy Father mentioned in 2016 to the International Union of Superiors General, that he was told that in Syria, in ancient Syria, when a woman accused her husband of beating her, she would go to the woman deacon, who would take the case and investigate, examine the bruises, and give testimony to the bishop. That can't happen. That really can't happen by chance. The bishop determined that a cleric, a woman deacon, would give testimony. And I think it's fascinating that we have evidence in the ancient world of women's testimony being taken by a bishop. But that may not be the case in other areas. So you can't say historically that flat out no woman was ordained, but neither can you say flat out that all of them were ordained. And today you can't say flat out every single diocese in the world needs women deacons, but neither can you say that none of them does. I would say, and it's not so much a criticism of Sister Elizabeth, but the term permanent diaconate is problematic because there is one diaconate, and one is ordained to the diaconate as a permanent vocation, whereas in a throwback to the Cursus Honorum, candidates for priesthood are also ordained as deacons before they are ordained as priests. I hope that answers your question. If not, I'll keep going.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. We might move on to another question. There are a few lining up now. Dennis Bristow has a question early on, which is, why is the church so hesitant about female deacons?
I can tell you I was told 25 years ago by the most senior woman in the Vatican that they can't say no, they just don't want to say yes. So hesitation, I would say it's more intractability. I would say it's more inertia. They simply have this problem. And one of the things, oh, well, it's the camel's nose under the tent, which may be an American expression. They really want to be priests. And of course, we can't do that. Well, it's not my study. It's not my discussion. And Pope Francis has said many times, he doesn't think he could do that. Cardinal Grech has said, doctrine is not to be discussed. And I think that the important thing about the document for the continental stage and the Instrumentum Laboris is that despite the fact that there was discussion of priesthood in the various reports that came in, it simply did not come up as part of discussion. So the fact that it's specifically almost surgically excised and put into the Instrumentum Laboris, I think is hopeful, because now a real discussion. Why is there traction against it? I'm not a psychologist.
Thank you, Phyllis. And Rowena, I think she's probably just answered your question in that response, which is helpful. Julie has a question, Phyllis. Do you know much about how the next stage of the Synod process will unfold in the fall, Northern Hemisphere fall? The question is included in the working document, the point to discuss paths to implementing if the restoration is nearly universally requested.
Well, the Instrumental Labores has, I think I said 4 parts. One is the roadmap. It's kind of a cookbook, as Cardinal Grech explained it. I think it's more like the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. You can't understand them just using them. You just have to do it. And I don't know what will happen. There will be I am not a part. I have not been invited to be an expert, nor have I been invited to be a member of the Synod. I don't know what they'll be talking about. How can this how is this envisaged? Well, you ordain women. I have said repeatedly that it would be disastrous to say, as Cardinal Casper said in 2006, oh, well, we can call them deacons or deaconesses, and they can dress up and they can work on the altar, but we can't ordain them. The idea of some kind of a fourth order non-ordained has been floated, and I think that would be disastrous, because the argument that I was given twice in person by staff of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was that women cannot image Christ. And I pointed out that that was probably heretical, and said, watch me. And I wrote a book. I wrote Women Icons of Christ. So I was like, you can't say that to me. So.
Thank you, Phyllis. Phyllis, Christine has a question. Can you please comment on the option for women to be cardinals? I was told that canon law does not require ordination as a prerequisite for being a cardinal. Is this true?
Well, it would have been true before 1917, but I think that the last lay cardinal died at the turn of the 19th century, and he really wasn't a lay cardinal because, as was the custom, he had been tonsured, and he actually was named a cardinal before he was made a deacon. Having said that, we need to remember that there are 3 stages or 3 levels of being a cardinal: cardinal deacon, cardinal priest, and cardinal cardinal bishop. There is no level, if you might say, of cardinal layperson. Having said that, the current canons say that the person must be at least a priest and is asked to accept ordination as a bishop. Some don't. I have often said that it's easier to have a woman cardinal than it is to have a woman deacon at this point. But I think it would eventuate to be a cardinal deacon. I don't see any reason why not. Whether the individual named cardinal would be as a layperson or as a deacon, because, as I said, in our history we do have sort of a history of lay cardinals, but as I said, most of them, or all of them that I know of, were at least tonsured and therefore became clerics, and that gets all messed up with the cursus honorum, really. Which the Holy Father is broken open in 2 different directions, with the change to the canons allowing women to be, as you mentioned at the top, instituted as lectors and acolytes, and also the new instituted ministry, which the Second Vatican Council said, if you need more ministries, create them, of catechists. So my fear is that catechist is an end run around deacons, but I don't know if we want to go there.
Thank you, Phyllis. I'm not sure who the person is. We just have a number, but they asked the question, what practical steps can supporters of women as deacons take in diocesan settings to promote this cause?
Could you repeat that?
What practical steps can supporters of women deacons take in diocesan settings to promote this cause?
Well, I think to talk about it. We're asked to be in Synod, and I think I wrote a piece not long ago in Commonweal, which was online, and it also appeared to LaCroix online. The Synod is almost like the way institutes of religious life were invented in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. A group of individuals sat around and said, what are the needs? How can we best spread the gospel in our situation? And I think to be in synod in your diocese and say, how can we best explain to the world that women are made in the image and likeness of Christ? How can we best explain the gospel teachings about women and men being valuable? And that goes in many directions, the life issues, at both ends of life issues. So I would say, talk to your bishop. I would say, have speakers. I would say, it doesn't always have to be me. There are people all over the world who have deeply, deeply considered this question, women and men, who are continuing to discuss it. Feast of St. Phoebe is coming up on September 3rd. It's a Sunday, and maybe ask your bishop to talk about St. Phoebe, or ask to have there's a group in the United States actually called Discerning Deacons. They have all sorts of recommendations and materials, and they're asking for people to speak about St. Phoebe on September 3rd in their parish or their diocese. I've been asked to do, for Catholic Women Preach in the United States, a talk on St. Phoebe for September 3rd. So what can you do in your parish or diocese? All of the above. You don't only have to buttonhole your bishop. I would almost go after the major donors to the diocese and have them buttonhole the bishop, but that's,
Thank you, Phyllis. I think that's very helpful advice. Sister Veronica Rosier has a question. What light does the Anglican position and experience of the ordination of women give us?
Well, it doesn't help, actually, because the Anglican communion, particularly in London, in England, was so worried about women priests, because again, they're stuck in the cursus honorum themselves at the time, thinking that if somebody was a deacon, they were automatically on the track to priesthood. And so in the early 70s, the Anglican communion, particularly in England, began to ordain women as deacons right, left, and center, because they wanted to eliminate the possibility of women as priests. I think that's settled down now, and there are Anglican women who are deacons in as permanent vocation, but it is a common objection that, well, look at the Anglicans, they ordain women as deacons, and now they have all these women priests running all over here and there and everywhere. So we're not Anglicans, and we're Catholics, and with all due respects to the Anglican communion, I think the problem in the United States that I see is that many of the married priests that we were Anglican priests who left the Anglican communion or the Episcopal Church in the United States because they objected to women priests and deacons. So I don't know if they'd have to go back now if we had women deacons. I don't know, just.
It's an interesting question. Professor Robert Gascoigne has a question. If women can be ordained as deacons and many women take up this vocation, in what ways do you think this could develop the scope, role, and character of the diaconate?
I think it would be helpful, because the diaconate is, as I said in the talk, it's one of ministry. And I've had bishops, I always remember a bishop, now a cardinal, but when he was the archbishop in the United States, he said he was very annoyed by many of the deacons he had because they were Sunday dress-up guys. They didn't really do anything. They just showed up on Sunday and dressed up and marched around. And but the work such as Sister Elizabeth, her ministry, the ministry of so many other women's in less directly parish pastoral work, but but in work that is clearly diaconal in the management of social service agencies and catechesis. I want to hear them. And the homily is part of the liturgy. And the only person who can give the homily, as you all know better than I, is the person who participates, the cleric who participates in the given Mass. And the homily, legally at least, I want to hear Sister Elizabeth's homily legally in a Mass in the cathedral. And I want Sister Elizabeth to be standing next to the Pope in St. Peter's, proclaiming the gospel and preaching, because then she and we as a church are saying to the world that women are made in the image and likeness of Christ. You know, we sit in our, air-conditioned, or in your case, heated offices, and the rest, so much of the world, they're as the reading says today, they're crying at the openings of their tents. They're starving. And women are still abused. There's an article in New York Times yesterday about a small area in India where a man has 2 daughters, and he began a crusade to recognize the value of women children, because it was the case, and still is the case in many parts in India, where prenatal testing will show that a female child will be had, and that female child is aborted. When one of his daughters was born, the midwife or nurse gave the child to him with apologies that it was a female. That ends up with a total imbalance. And in the years that he has worked in his little area in India, the balance has gone from 50%, say 50 females to 100 males. It has become more equal. And, you have in societies, you have dowry burnings and dowry suicides still in India. In certain areas of the world, you still have women restricted to menstruation huts because they're dirty. You have such stupid taboos and restrictions of women not allowed to go out by themselves, women not allowed to drive, women not allowed to vote. I don't have the numbers in my head, but there is still plenty of countries where women are still chattel. And legally or not, there is still that attitude among men. Throughout my life, I have 5 academic degrees, and if people don't have my name or a string of numbers or degrees after it, I have been treated like a dimwit, and by men. And it's so the earlier question about why is the Vatican dragging its heels? There's an attitude over there, and it's quite misogynistic. It's quite sexist, and they're all very polished and very proper, but it's there. And the mere fact that the Holy Father called a commission 50% male and 50% female was astonishing to them, that all these females were marching into CDF on a serious commission. I mean, this is revolutionary over there. So.
Thank you, Phyllis. Catherine, I'll come back to your question. Anthony's got a question that's related to what you were just speaking about then, Phyllis, a little bit. The diaconate in the Catholic Church is not well understood or implemented. Deacons are frequently marginalised and not included in consultations in dioceses or synods. They are not remunerated and not present in all dioceses. Would any of this change with women in the diaconate?
Probably not right away. I can remember years ago, a friend of mine, the rector of St. Patrick's Cathedral, said, "Oh, you want to be a deacon? No, you're going to be a volunteer." The fact of the matter is that the diaconate was marginalized in the 12th century, finally, and absorbed into the Cursus Honorum, to the point where no one was ordained. Very few men were ordained as deacons unless they were on the way to priesthood. Why? Because the deacons managed the money. I mean, it's as simple as that. So for the diaconate to reclaim itself is a long road up. Priests and bishops don't understand the diaconate. If they have deacons, they use them as sometimes as glorified altar boys or as slave labor. I think that, however, what I have seen in the United States, at least, is that there are two candidates for a parish life coordinator, Canon 517, paragraph 2, parish life coordinator, which I assume is Elizabeth Young's position. The deacon wins. If it's a deacon and a lay person, the deacon gets the job. Many chancellors in the United States are deacons. And in talking to bishops about this, they say they really would prefer someone they have trained, ordained, and given faculties to hire full-time in a job. Now, canon law doesn't require the bishop to give any kind of job to a deacon, but if he does, the job has to be sufficient to pay for the man's, at this point, man's family support and needs. So it's an evolution. I think it's an evolution that one would hope would come depending on the various the culture in which it is developed. But again, that the reason, I think part of the reason deacons are not respected is because the formation and selection of deacons has not been that good in many cases. And so deacons in general have a bad name because they are good people, but some of them have not been given the ability, have not been given the training, really, the formation. And you wonder, in a way, can that happen? I mean, I've often said, you take a 55-year-old man and give him an office book and say, put for you're a cleric. I think things take a little bit more, to mature, if I may.
Thank you, Phyllis. Jennifer has a question. Where is it written that only ordained people can preach? Is this in canon law? Couldn't this be changed?
Yes, it's in canon law. It probably will not be changed because the homily historically is part of the liturgy, and to the way women and other lay people are able to preach, so to speak, is twofold. One, in 1994, there was a determination by the Congregation for Divine Worship that at masses for children, people better able to speak to children could preach or speak the homily. The other way, there are three ways actually. The second way which is kind of illegal, would be at the time of the homily, the priest or bishop who is celebrating the Mass will say a few words. That's his homily, and he will then introduce the lay person to speak. The legal way is after communion, an individual who is not a cleric can give a reflection. But in any event, the law is, and it's, I don't know if it's canon law or liturgical law, but the law is that only a cleric who participates in the liturgy is to be the preacher, which means, Father Missionary can't sit in the sacristy and pop out for 3 masses unless he's part of the masses, and that's done. So.
Thank you, Phyllis. Catherine has a question here. She has been told that her soul only images God, not her physical appearance. What is the best way to respond to this type of thinking?
Can you spell heresy? I mean, that's ridiculous. Jesus became human. That is the important part of the incarnation, the extremely phenomenal, incredible bringing of God to earth. Now, the accidents are there. Jesus is male. There are other accidents of his body that are not replicated by many males in the world. His skin color, his hair color, his teeth, and so that's really what's called naive physicalism, which I mentioned. You know, the mistake is between the human male Jesus and the risen Lord, and the risen Lord is in you and in me. And as I said, if I can't see Jesus in males and females, I don't see Jesus at all. I don't see Christ.
Anthony has a comment here about formation for deacons, noting that the norms from 1998 for formation of deacons require a formation that is equivalent to presbyteral formation, normally 5 or 6 years, including a degree in theology. And he says the norms for deacons are modelled on the norms for formation of presbyters. Do you have any comment on how deacons might be better formed, Phyllis?
Well, sure, spiritual, human, intellectual, and pastoral formation is required. And the directory, the 1998 directory, is very specific. But the way it is interpreted and the way it is acted upon varies from diocese to diocese, country to country. And some deacons are fabulous, really wonderful. I'd rather hear them than the parish priest, who may have less education. I don't think it's about education. I think it's about vocation. And I think that in the 60 years now since the Second Vatican Council and 1972 with the documents specifically about the diaconate, I think it's been an uneven development, and I think it's still developing. I think the biggest problem is deacons who don't do diaconal work. Just as there's problems with priests who don't do priestly work. I mean, you can tell by their preaching. And I hope that the deacons are being allowed to preach. Some deacons are not even allowed to preach by their pastors, which is a crime to me. But anyway.
Phyllis, I have a question just with regard to the argument that some will take on the historical evidence regarding the sacramentality of the ordination of female deacons, the historical evidence. Given that the notion of sacrament has changed so dramatically over the history of the Church, on what ground do you imagine that a position can be put that the evidence that you have pointed to from history about the sacramental ordination of women to the diaconate is questioned?
If the men of history were sacramentally ordained, then so were the women. You can't separate the two. The only way to separate the two is to say that women cannot be ordained then or now. And why can't women be ordained then or now? Because women can't image Christ. That is the circular argument, really. And as I said, history alone is not dispositive. There will be arguments forever over when were sacraments invented? Is it with the sentences of Peter Lombard? Yves Congar, has the history of ordination. The only person in Scripture with the job title deacon is Phoebe. Now, was she ordained? Well, what did it mean at that time to be ordained? St. Paul obviously felt that she was able to carry the letter to the Romans and probably to explain it to them. We don't have such evidence, really, of others. So I just think I've said this forever. And my first book, Holy Saturday, really doesn't go into the historical argument. Holy Saturday really talks about the ability of women today to be ordained, and just says yes, and there were women deacons in history, because it'll never end. No one will ever. I mean, I read an article actually by a member of the Second Commission that said, oh, the women of history weren't really ordained. She found a liturgy, and the reason the women weren't really ordained was because they didn't kneel down in front of the bishop. They stood up when he laid hands on them. And I was like, yeah. And you're expecting a woman in the ancient world to kneel down in front of a man. You know, I just, it's circular. And what happened to the men happened to the women. The 2002 document is it's just bad and plagiarized without citation from a book that argues against women priests. Mueller took all of the discussion about the arguments against women being ordained as priests and applied them to the diaconate. And that's really what people are trying to do today. And yet the document is you should read the document in French, which is the original, because the English translation is bad, but the English translation also drops the point that it's the magisterial discussion as approved by the Second Vatican Council, okay, that the priesthood is not the diaconate, that these are separate orders. And we have that again in 2009 with Omnium Momentum, where the Holy Father really is rectifying canon law, Benedict XVI, to accommodate the teaching of the Catechism, that the diaconate is a ministry separate from the priesthood and the episcopate. So I don't think it's worth arguing. It's very nice if you determine, if you believe that women were in history sacramentally ordained. If you don't believe women were sacramentally ordained in history, then you don't believe men were sacramentally ordained in history. And you bring the question to the present. And even with the change of determination of when sacraments, became sacraments, we have evidence in the East and the West to the 12th century at least, and certainly later in the East, of women being ordained as deacons.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phyllis. Thank you, everybody, for the questions that you have put forward. I would particularly like to thank Phyllis for her marvelous public lecture and for the amazing generosity she's shown in engaging with our questions. Thank you very much, Phyllis. It's been a terrific conversation, and I'm very grateful to everybody who has attended. Can I also please thank Sister Elizabeth Young for her lovely response and her sharing with us the very important work that she is doing in one of the very remote parts of Australia that is so in need of very strong leadership there in Wilcannia. With that, thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you so much, Phyllis, and wish you all the very best until our next public lecture. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.